So again, my name is Amber Bradford. I'm the mental health therapist at the Children's Advocacy Center up the street. I do trauma work specifically with kids. However, trauma treatments are pretty cross-generational, and the treatment models vary with different ages, but very applicable. There's a lot of different treatment interventions that are out there that can be used to treat traumas, and various traumas I'm going to be specifically talking about and referencing trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or TFCBT, if I mention it again. I'm going to start with explaining kind of generally with traumas, any kind of trauma, again, whether it's mass shootings, violence, domestic violence, child abuse, witnessing violence, car crashes. People generally have the idea that I'm going to not think about it, not talk about it, not feel about it, and that way it'll kind of go away, I'm going to ignore it, and things will get better. So the idea is I'm going to decrease thinking, talking, and feeling about it in order to decrease the stress and anxiety and trauma symptoms that Christina kind of mentioned earlier, the nightmares, flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, any kind of avoidance, hypervigilance, that type of thing. So the idea, naturally, people have decreased thinking, talking, and feeling to decrease the stress and anxiety. However, that actually creates the opposite effect. The more that people try to decrease thinking, talking, and feeling about traumas, it increases the stress and anxiety, increases trauma symptoms, maladaptive cognitions, which are the negative, unhealthy thoughts attached to traumas. So you can do the math and assume that the more that you think, talk, and feel about it, that's actually what's going to decrease the stress and anxiety related to any type of specific trauma that a person has experienced. With trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, it's a really unique treatment model because it's really specific to the trauma, to the event that happened. And Christina was kind of explaining it beautifully when she said I would go in every session and my therapist would say, okay, tell me what happened from beginning to end. And what that is essentially is exposure process, and it's getting somebody to engaging with the thoughts, emotions, and feelings that they're having related to whatever it is that's bringing them in to work on trauma. That's essentially what TFCBT is as well. So it's a slow process of exposure over time to engage and internalize different thoughts and feelings. With TFCBT, there's essentially two main goals. Obviously, there's individual treatment goals, but overarching, everything can be encompassed in these two main goals. One is identifying and decreasing trauma symptoms. Again, those are the nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, decreased sense of safety, things like that. Identifying and decreasing those, and identifying, challenging, and correcting any maladaptive cognitions. Those are the negative, unhealthy thoughts. So that's where you essentially figure out what is the story that a person is telling themselves about what happened. Does it make sense? Is it helpful? And is it true? And if it's not all three of those things, then we need to come up with something that makes sense, is more helpful, and is true. With different traumas, the common cognitions are going to be really different and kind of specific to whatever their specific trauma is. Christina mentioned a couple of them, people feeling, kind of the kind of figuring out, am I a victim, am I a survivor, I was injured, I wasn't injured, what does that mean, should have been me, it could have been me, it wasn't me, and just all of the different things that go into, shootings and mass violence things, as well as, it's my fault, I should have done something to stop it, I could have done something to stop it, I must have done something wrong to deserve it, all kinds of things. So you get the point. Those are all things that are not healthy to have long-term internalized. The way that TFCBT goes about addressing those two goals is starting with psychoeducation. So essentially what that is normalizing thoughts, normalizing feelings, letting the person know that you are having a normal reaction to an abnormal event, letting them know that it's okay to have whatever feeling you are feeling. And then also just some kind of education around whatever trauma they're there for. So maybe bringing in case studies, maybe talking about different things that other people who've gone through that have said and experienced. Next is going through relaxation stuff. So teaching and equipping people to manage emotions when they need to. So when they do try and go back to school and they're taking a math test and they get a flashback, how are you going to handle that in the moment so that you can continue functioning in life? So really, again, just basic practical relaxation skills. Next is affect regulation, which is basically talking about emotions and emotion regulation. So how do you deal with your emotions, whether they're kind of on the broader spectrum of everything else in your life, as well as specifically related to the trauma, and again, engaging with those emotions. Every piece of treatment is really about engaging with the emotions and engaging with the memories of what happened, because at the end, you want, it's never going to go away. So no one is ever going to forget what happened to them. And so you want to help get people to a place where they can have a trigger, have a memory, have a moment where they're thinking about it, and have it just be a memory and be able to be in control of that thought, rather than be thrown into this full-blown flashback where they become non-functioning for a period of time. So I was on emotions. So the next piece is the cognitive processing, and again, that's kind of where the story piece comes out. Figuring out, helping people identify, what do you think? And sometimes people have no idea. Sometimes people come to you and it's this intense emotional thing that is unlike anything that they would ever have dreamed or imagined, and they're still figuring out, what do I think about this, and what does this mean about who I am and who I was, and what does this mean for my future? So helping, again, sort that story out with them. And then when there is a negative maladaptive thought and cognition that comes up, challenging that with them, not telling them it's not okay to think that, but just challenging and helping them through the process of deciding, is this something I'm okay living the rest of my life internalizing? And as therapists, there's all of these really cool ways of helping people get to that part on their own without you having to say, don't think like that. That makes them feel really, really empowered. And that sounds like manipulation, and I promise that's not what we do. The next piece is the trauma narrative, and that's essentially what Christina was talking about. That's where we're going to sit down and talk about exactly what happened from beginning to end in as much detail as possible. A lot of times that's the part that people kind of freak out about, and they say, well, isn't that just going to re-traumatize me, and isn't that going to make it worse? And I try and forget about it, and I say, no, that's actually the piece that's going to make the most difference. And if we pretend it didn't ever happen and try and ignore it, your symptoms are never going to go away. So sometimes it literally looks like session after session after session of, let's sit down and you tell me about it and tell me everything you can remember, and what were you thinking and what were you feeling. And again, that piece is really just to get people to engage with those emotions, because if they can think about it and retell the story in session with you, then when they start to have the memories and the triggers in the grocery store or in math class, or when they're talking to somebody who says something really insensitive, it might be a hard moment for them, and some days might be worse than others, but they've managed to create a space for themselves to deal with it. The last part is in vivo exposure, and that's really, again, I already said the whole process is essentially exposure therapy, but the last piece is if there's anything left over. So the reason the exposure piece is left until the end is specific triggers usually will work themselves out naturally by the time you get to the end of treatment. So those would be things like I can't wear the blue shoes that I was wearing that day anymore, or I can't wear blue shoes at all, or red notebooks remind me of that day, and so I can't be around red notebooks. So things like that are really tangible triggers. We'll do in vivo exposure around those, and those are just kind of, if somebody's scared of a spider, you start by looking at spiders on pictures of spiders, and then you bring a spider in a jar, that type of thing. But of course, you make it applicable to what their trauma is. You don't bring spiders. That's essentially it, in a nutshell, what the treatment looks like. TFCBT is also really unique in that it's generally a shorter treatment model. Sometimes people hear that and they think that you're getting less of good treatment. It really, that's not true. It just, the way that it's created, generally it is a shorter treatment, but can last a year and a half or several years if if that's a need of a person. I think another piece of the treatment side is also looking at who are we calling victims and survivors, and who are the people needing treatment, because looking at secondary victims as well. So, that could be the person who was at school, not in the same building, who wasn't injured, or somebody's mom who was on the other side of the country who's just having a really hard time processing what happened. It can really span a broad spectrum of people who might need treatment, and so I think it's important not to create that stigma of, well, you weren't involved, or you weren't actually in the room, or you didn't have the same experience that somebody else did, and just letting it be treatment is treatment. The other thing is early intervention produces the most quickly efficient long-term effect. However, it is really difficult because the last thing that people want to do after such a traumatizing event is go and talk about it. And so it's kind of this, you're stuck in between a rock and a hard place, because there is a lot of research that does show earliest intervention is best. However, not forcing people into treatment and being really, supportive and conscious of they are in their own space. And I do believe that, people will go when they're able to, but just being conscious of offering it and having the education of why treatment is going to be helpful and can be helpful, and providing that in a really, just caring and compassionate way. And trauma work is really difficult. So that's the other thing, is I would never tell a client that this is going to make you feel a lot better and you should just do it and it's going to be great and fun and easy, because it's not, and it's painful and it's difficult and it's tough, because you're engaging in emotions and you're dealing with things that the thought is that it would be easier to forget about, and we know that isn't an option, but it's really, really, really tough work, and it's not easy. And so, when Christina says that, for every day or every session for a year she was late and didn't want to go, and it makes sense because people come up with every single reason to not complete treatment or to not come back the next week, because it is challenging. And so I think that another side of that is just recognizing and telling people, like, this is possibly one of the hardest things that you might have to do in your healing, and so giving space for that as well. And I think that's all I have for you guys, and I believe we're going into question and answers.